Okay, so why is it that Gen X keeps getting hit the hardest? Like every challenge piles on us at the worst possible time. Today I want to talk about those challenges and, more importantly, what we can do to lighten the load of them. Because yes, we've been blindsided, but we're Gen X and we got this. And the first one I want to talk about is sandwich generation stress. The problem is that Gen X is squeezed between, aging parents that are living longer, with expensive medical needs to go along with that, and kids reaching adulthood who are struggling to launch in today's economy. We're being pulled in opposing directions and something has to give. We can't shoulder the entire planet's problems for ourselves and everyone else. It's totally unsustainable. So we got to start now having real conversations with our parents about long-term care or what their wishes or their plans might be. Now's the time to get them talking about their finances. And if you are going to have to step in as a caregiver, there are lots of care agreements and things online, templates, and you might think, oh, I don't need that, but becoming a caregiver, and a lot of past ones and current ones can tell you it's a complicated endeavor sometimes. And just having an agreement that you make even yourself, just DIY, some of the expectations, and you probably don't even know what those questions to ask or things to think about are. And that's why, I suggest maybe going online, looking at some of those care agreements. There's a lot of good resources out there that can kind of prepare you mentally for these things. And with your adult kids, failure to launch isn't an excuse. We've got to set some boundaries and some expectations. If they can't afford to move out, then assign them, adult responsibilities and charge them rent. If they insist on college that they can't afford, and I mean, seriously, who can? That's what student loans are for, the student, not the parent. And it might sound harsh, but our role here is to guide our children into independence and, keeping our parents as independent as long as possible. And number 2 is the American dream that's crumbling all around us. The old formula, job, house, car, family, it doesn't seem to add up anymore. And even the modern dream, adding college and career and prosperity to that, it feels totally out of reach. And what can we do? Really the only thing we can do is we have to redefine success on our own terms. If the old dream doesn't fit anymore, then we have to create our own. And for some of us, we may even have to adjust, our expectations and come back down to planet Earth a little bit. Because luxury is not normal for the middle class. We don't need gated communities and $50,000 cars. In this crumbling American dream situation, it might only be temporary. So think of this as only a temporary era of restraint. And in the meantime, there's nothing, stopping you from saving more money or stashing money away. Of course, that might mean you're going to have to find more, find ways to bring more in. But stash that money away in the hope of a better day when we can dream that dream again. And number 3 is retirement uncertainty. Pensions are all but gone, and Social Security keeps threatening their cuts, in a few years, right when Gen X is going to need it the most. For Gen X, we're too close to retirement to just start fresh, but we can't just, hide our eyes and hope all this goes away either. We're being shown that the only thing we can count on is the actual money that we can save and put away for ourselves. Yet, that leaves us with a question that no other generation has ever had to ask themselves. How much is enough, and will I run out before I die? For some Gen Xers, the path is to save as much as possible, work as long as possible, delay Social Security until 67 or 70. In fact, that's probably the reality for a lot of Gen Xers. Others, they're planning on the 4% withdrawal rate, saving 25 times their annual expenses. That answers those looming questions of, hopefully that's enough. Fidelity even puts out a different figure. They recommend you save 10 times your salary by age 67. But these are all just guideposts. They're not guarantees, but they do help frame the target a little bit. We're all approaching 50 or over 50, so we've got to take advantage, one way or the other, of these catch-up contributions that we're allowed to do. If that means getting a side hustle or a part-time job and funneling every bit of that income, into a retirement account. Ask yourself, can you keep up this same level of spending in retirement? But, controlled spending, that's not enough in this economy. There's got to be ways to increase that income coming in as well. And avoid putting your future in the hands of get-rich schemes as well, such as investing everything in private equity or crypto or a trip to Vegas. Now, if you want to have a little crypto, that's fine. That we'll do whatever. I know I'm going to hear about that in the comments. And number 4 is healthcare costs. Man, I sound like a broken record on this one. But Gen X, we're stuck in that pre-Medicare gap and paying sky-high premiums and the deductibles that go with them. One medical event can wipe out our savings. And since we can't overhaul the U.S. healthcare system ourselves, the next best strategy is to just need it less. You got to leverage preventative care and lifestyle changes now, not later. And think of that as a financial strategy. Every step taken toward lowering your blood pressure or your weight or your blood sugar, and it reduces the catastrophic costs that come later. Think of it this way. On one side you have health, and then on the other side you have the healthcare system. And you just need to gravitate toward the one you want more of. The greatest investment that you can make is in your health. And there's no one that can do that better than you. Number 5 is identity shifts and career squeeze. Gen X, we're fighting ageism and AI at the same time. And we're being overlooked, in favor of the younger digital natives. But we're not old enough to retire. And add to that, role reversals, parenting our parents versus our kids, empty nest, divorce. It leaves some of us feeling more irrelevant than we ever have. And it's true that Gen X, we're in transition territory right now. But here's the thing. We've been there before, so we have experience at transitions. This is the time to reclaim your identity. And if it means an intentional reinvention, through a new job or hobbies, a new purpose, then now is the time to do that. We're still young enough to start a new chapter, many new chapters. But don't hesitate too long on this one, because reinvention can be life-changing in a good way. And number 6 is debt load and wage stagnation. Between the years of 1979 and 2013, wages for middle wage workers only rose 6% over that entire time span. That's less than 0.2% each year. Meanwhile, cost of housing and food and utilities, all of that's exploded. For Gen X, that means working harder but treading more water. And at the same time, we're becoming the most indebted generation. I'll pop a graphic up here so you can see. Everyone is wondering, is the sky gonna fall? Inflation and interest rates, they're still shaky and unpredictable. A recession could happen at any time. When you see storm clouds coming, you prepare for it with a quickness. And that means stabilizing every area of your life that you can. If everyone else is drowning in debt, you don't have to be. To be different, that might mean, when everyone else is eating out 2 or 3 times a week, you don't. When everyone else is trading their car every few years, you don't. Instead of buying clothes at the mall, you're buying them at thrift stores, or Walmart, or Ross, or TJ Maxx. Or I'm betting that you've probably got enough clothes to last the next 5 years anyway. Save, don't spend, pay in full, don't go in debt. Job security, not job hopping. And number 7 is divorce in midlife. Many Gen Xers married, drifted apart, and are now divorcing at higher rates than any other generation. This can be very difficult to bounce back from, emotionally and financially. Unlike in your 20s or 30s, there's less time to rebuild that savings and stability, which makes the impact of divorce hit much harder at this age. And this one is such a personal issue because, people get divorced for many, many reasons. But regardless of where you find yourself when it comes to divorce, you just know that you're not alone. And just treat this as a total life reset, a new beginning. Rebuild your finances from the ground up and prioritize that retirement savings. Try your best to resist bitterness and just keep moving forward. And just because we're Gen Xers, there's nothing wrong with seeking help if you need it. Whether that's professional or an online support group, there is a community out there if you seek it. Life is never going to be problem-free. We're going to be solving problems the rest of our life. That's part of being alive. But we can lighten the burden one decision at a time. Whether that's redefining retirement, paying off those debts, reinventing your career. I hope today I've given you some positives to focus on, some breaks in the clouds, a few pieces of advice to move forward with. Let me know in the comments, what is your focus on these days? And if you liked this video today, let me know by hitting the thumbs up button. I've got another video right here on why slowing down after 55 is the worst mistake Gen Xers can make. Just click here and you'll be magically transported to another video that speaks to the Gen Xer in you. I hope you are all having a good week so far. I will see you in the next video. Bye.